I'm a 27-year-old guy, and I've been working as a mechanic for the past few years. I love cars, always have. After a couple of years of saving, I finally bought myself a car last year, a sleek black sedan that I poured my heart and savings into. It wasn't just any car to me, it was my pride. I'd spent months customizing it, adding parts here and there, making it feel like mine in every way. From the engine to the leather seats, it was my dream ride. But my dad, well, he never got it. He's never really respected my choices when it came to spending my own money. He always saw cars as a waste of cash, just another stupid expense. I'd heard his speeches before, things like, why spend on that when you could save? Or you're throwing money away. I learned to brush it off because he's just old school that way, but it got under my skin sometimes. Especially because, despite everything, I thought he'd respect how hard I'd worked to get that car. For as long as I can remember, dads had money problems. They come and go like waves. Sometimes he's doing all right, and then out of nowhere, he's in trouble again. I never knew the full details, but I had a feeling things were rough for him recently. Still, I never imagined he'd do anything crazy. Not until that day. It was a regular Tuesday morning when I went outside to find my car wasn't in the driveway. My first thought was that maybe my dad had moved it, but the longer I looked, the more I started to feel a gnawing sense of panic. I walked up and down the street, even checked with the neighbors to see if anyone had noticed anything, but no one had seen it. I ran inside and found him in the kitchen, trying to act casual. My heart was pounding, but I tried to keep it together as I asked him if he'd seen my car. He shrugged it off, saying something vague about needing space in the driveway. But there was something in his voice, something shifty. He wouldn't look me in the eyes, which is when I felt the first real pang of worry. I started pressing him, my voice getting louder without meaning to. I needed answers. He kept brushing me off, muttering things that didn't add up. After what felt like an eternity, he finally let it slip. He'd sold it. My car. The car I'd spent years saving for, hours working on, my pride and joy, it was gone. Dad looked at me like he was expecting me to just understand. He told me he'd needed the money, that he'd been backed into a corner and had no other choice. He thought I'd get it. I was speechless, caught between fury and shock. How could he think I'd be okay with this? He'd taken something that didn't belong to him, something that meant the world to me, and just sold it off without even asking. He genuinely believed that I'd forgive him, because according to him, family comes first, and apparently my car didn't count. I couldn't believe it. My mind was spinning as I tried to wrap my head around what he'd done. I demanded to know where my car was, who he'd sold it to, how much he'd gotten for it, but he was dodging my questions, giving me vague answers like he didn't owe me an explanation. The betrayal was sinking in deep, and I couldn't shake the anger building up inside me. I thought about all the late nights, the extra hours I'd worked, the sacrifices I'd made just to save up for that car, and how he'd undone it all in a moment without a second thought. My friends were just as shocked as I was when I told them what happened. They threw out ideas, asking if maybe it had been stolen, suggesting I check local security cameras, but the more I talked it out with them, the more the awful reality hit me. My dad had sold it for real, not caring what it meant to me. After piecing things together, I confronted him one more time, asking if he was going to make it right. He just looked at me, almost annoyed, and said that he didn't have any other options. In his mind, he'd done what he had to do, and that was that. He said I could always get another car later, as if that somehow made it okay. I could feel myself losing control, every word he said making it worse. My dad didn't get it, he didn't care. To him, my car was just a thing he could use to fix his problems. That's when I realized that this wasn't just about a car. It was about respect. I had no idea where to go from here, but I knew one thing for sure, I wasn't going to let this slide. My friends suggested going to the police. Some even offered to help me look into legal options. I could tell they thought I should hold him accountable, that he'd crossed a line. And they were right. When I told him I might have to get the law involved, he looked at me like I'd lost my mind, like he couldn't believe I'd actually go that far. But what else was I supposed to do? He'd left me no choice. I gave him one last chance, told him he had a few days to get my car back, or I'd have to take it further. He didn't say a word, didn't even seem fazed. That just fueled my anger more. I couldn't believe he thought he'd get away with this, that I just let it go. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Update 1. After a few days passed without any word from my dad, it became clear he wasn't planning to return my car or make any effort to resolve this. He ignored my ultimatum completely, as if I'd never even given him one. I waited and checked in on him, expecting maybe a call or a text with some kind of explanation, but nothing, just silence. It felt like he thought I'd eventually just drop it, let it slide. But that wasn't going to happen. I started looking into legal options, unsure if it was even possible to pursue something like this with family involved. A friend referred me to a lawyer, and after explaining the situation, they advised me to press charges. According to them, the value of the car alone made this a case worth pursuing, not to mention the fact that I could provide solid proof of ownership. The lawyer laid it all out, saying that I needed to gather every document related to my car purchase. So I went through my files, pulling out receipts, proof of purchase, and insurance documents, basically anything that could show without a doubt that the car was mine and mine alone. Word about what had happened spread quickly through my family. Some of them reached out with reactions all over the place. A few of them supported me and agreed that my dad had crossed a major line. But then there were others, the ones who thought this was something I should let go because it was just family business. They didn't see the car as a big deal and figured it was better to keep the peace. I tried to explain that it wasn't just about the car, it was about respect and boundaries. My mom got involved, which was a surprise. She usually tries to stay out of conflicts, especially ones that involve my dad. But this time, she called me and said she had no idea he'd done something this extreme. She told me she felt blindsided and even betrayed, saying she didn't agree with what he did and understood why I was taking a stand. She still tried to mediate, though, hoping there was a way to fix things without making it a legal issue. But I'd already given my dad a chance, and he didn't take it seriously. After going back and forth on what to do, I decided to file a police report. It felt strange, honestly. This was my dad, after all, and I never thought I'd be in a position to do something like this. But it seemed like the only way to get through to him. The officer I spoke to took my report seriously, and they didn't treat it any differently just because it was family. They made it clear that if a crime had been committed, family ties didn't change the legal side of things. I told them this was my last resort. I just wanted my car back. When the police showed up at my dad's place to talk to him, it was a whole different story. He was furious, calling me all kinds of things, saying I was ungrateful, and that he'd only done it for the good of the family. He kept repeating that he didn't have a choice, as if that was supposed to make it all right. He accused me of disrespecting him and putting strangers the police before my own family. I could see how deeply he was in denial, convinced he'd done nothing wrong, and that I was the one who was out of line. Then my siblings started to weigh in. Some of them, mostly my older siblings, reached out to beg me to drop the report, saying I was tearing the family apart over just a car. They argued that things were already tough for our dad, and I was only making things worse. A few even said they were disappointed in me for not just letting it go. But I wasn't about to let guilt or family pressure make me back down. I knew I'd given my dad more than enough chances to make this right. Once the police began their investigation, they started reaching out to find out who had purchased the car. I had no idea who this person was, and honestly, I started to feel bad for whoever bought it, especially if they had no idea about any of this. But a couple of days later, I got an unexpected call. It was the buyer, and he sounded genuinely shocked when I told him the situation. Apparently, my dad hadn't mentioned that he didn't have permission to sell the car. The buyer told me he was willing to cooperate, and he apologized, saying he'd thought everything was legitimate. Meanwhile, my dad tried to buy more time, promising that if I just gave him a few more weeks, he could sort everything out and get the car back for me. I refused. I'd given him more than enough chances, and at this point, I couldn't trust a word he said. Every promise he made just sounded like another excuse to delay things, hoping I'd eventually drop it. In the middle of all this, I decided to post about the situation on Reddit. I figured maybe getting some outside perspective would help me figure out if I was overreacting or if I had every right to be doing what I was doing. The responses were pretty mixed. Some people completely supported me, saying my dad had crossed a line and that I had every right to go to the police. Others, though, questioned if taking legal action was the best move, considering it could tear my family apart. It was hard to read through some of those comments, but at the end of the day, I felt validated by the people who understood where I was coming from. As more time passed, I started noticing that my dad was growing desperate. I think he was beginning to realize that the situation was spiraling beyond his control. He had no idea that I'd take it this far, and now it was clear that I wasn't going to back down. With the buyer willing to cooperate and the police involved, it was only a matter of time before everything came to light. Update 2. Not long after filing the police report, my siblings decided to step in. They organized a family intervention, apparently hoping to make me see that pressing charges wasn't the answer. I got a text from my oldest sister saying they all wanted to talk, so I showed up, expecting a calm conversation. But from the moment I walked in, it was clear this was an ambush. Everyone was there, my siblings, my mom, and even a few cousins. They all looked at me like I was the one who'd done something wrong. They said I was being unreasonable, that our dad was in trouble, and I was only making things harder on him. They kept repeating that it was just a car and asked me to think about the bigger picture, the impact this would have on the family. I tried explaining my side, that this wasn't just about a car. I told them I couldn't just let it go, especially after he'd crossed this line. If I didn't stand up now, he'd keep taking things as if they were his to do with as he pleased. My words didn't seem to land, though. They were all focused on keeping the peace, like the car was just some minor issue that I was blowing out of proportion. Then, in the middle of the argument, my dad finally cracked. He broke down, saying he did it because he had no other options. He started sobbing, going on about how desperate he was and how he never thought it would come to this. He said he'd pay back half of the car's value, hoping that would be enough to make me drop everything. But for me, that wasn't even close to what was needed to make things right. He didn't seem to get that the money wasn't the issue. The family members in the room split after that. Some of them seemed to feel sorry for him, looking at me like I was the bad guy for not accepting his offer. Others were clearly on my side, but they kept quiet, just watching everything unfold without stepping in. I could feel the room dividing, with half of them just wanting this to be over and the rest understanding why I couldn't let it go. Not long after that, the police decided to escalate things. They showed up at his workplace to question him, which definitely caught him off guard. This was no longer just a family argument, it was real, and he had to face the consequences. That's when he started telling extended family members that I was exaggerating everything, claiming I never even used the car, that it just sat in the driveway most of the time. He tried to paint me as selfish, as if I was punishing him for something trivial. Meanwhile, my friends were rallying around me, constantly checking in and reminding me that I was doing the right thing. A couple of them even offered to help with legal costs if things dragged out, which meant a lot. Knowing I had people who genuinely supported me made it a little easier to push forward, even as my family was tearing itself apart over this. My dad's financial situation started to get worse as the investigation dragged on and word got around at his work. The pressure was clearly affecting him, and it created more tension at home. My mom kept asking me to just let it go, saying it was putting a strain on everyone. She wasn't happy about what he'd done, but she thought it was my responsibility to put family first. I knew I was making things hard for her, but I also knew I couldn't let him off the hook. The Reddit post I'd made was still getting attention, and I'd started updating it as things progressed. The reactions from strangers online were pretty intense. People were flooding the comments with support, telling me I wasn't wrong to take legal action. There was an outpouring of anger and outrage on my behalf, with people sharing their own stories of family betrayal. But of course, there were also people who said I was going too far, that I should forgive him because he's my dad. It was a lot to process, but reading those comments helped me feel like I wasn't alone in thinking this was a huge deal. Then, my lawyer took things up a notch by filing a formal demand for restitution. This wasn't just a threat, it was a clear legal statement that my dad either had to make things right or face the consequences. That's when my family arranged another meeting, this time with the intention of mediation. They thought if we could just sit down with a neutral party, we'd be able to reach some kind of agreement without going to court. The mediation started off tense but civil. Everyone sat down, and for a few minutes it seemed like we might actually get somewhere. But as soon as the mediator brought up compensation, my dad's defenses shot up. He started accusing me of dragging this out to make him look bad, and things quickly turned into a shouting match. He even threatened to counter-sue me for emotional distress, which honestly sounded ridiculous. I could hardly believe he was serious. The whole session dissolved into chaos, with everyone yelling over each other and no real progress being made. After that, I walked out more determined than ever. If he wanted to take this to court, fine. I was ready. For the first time in this whole mess, I felt like I knew exactly what needed to be done. It wasn't just about getting my car back or even getting compensated, it was about setting boundaries. This wasn't just going to be swept under the rug. Update 3. Not long after the failed mediation, I got a call from the buyer who'd unknowingly bought my car. He told me that he'd seen the post on Reddit, had followed the updates, and realized the full extent of the situation. He sounded shocked and apologetic. Apparently, he'd had no idea my dad sold the car without my permission. He didn't want any part of this mess and was willing to return the car. Arrangements were made, and the buyer came by with my car. But as soon as I saw it, I felt the sting of betrayal all over again. The car wasn't in the condition I'd left it in. There were scratches along one side, the front bumper was scraped, and it looked like it had taken a few hard hits on the road. The interior, once spotless, was now stained and scuffed in places that hadn't been before. I went over every inch of it, cataloging the damage and realizing that getting it back wasn't the end of this nightmare. Now I was facing repair costs. When my dad found out the buyer had returned the car, he was furious. He lashed out at the buyer, calling him a traitor and claiming he'd been manipulated by me into turning on him. The buyer didn't respond to the accusations, and honestly, I don't think he wanted any more involvement with my dad after seeing how unhinged things had become. He just handed over the keys and left as quickly as possible. With the car back, I told my dad that he needed to cover the repair costs to make things right. This wasn't about taking things further, it was about fixing the damage he'd caused. He laughed, saying he'd already lost enough over this, and that I should be grateful to have the car back at all. He refused outright, brushing off my request like it was an unreasonable demand. Then my mom got involved again. She showed up, asking me to consider dropping the whole thing for the sake of the family. She kept telling me that this was breaking everyone apart, and that I was making things harder than they needed to be. She didn't ignore the fact that what Dad did was wrong, but she begged me to just move on and let it go. I could see that she was struggling, caught in the middle, but it was clear she wanted the problem to just disappear without any real accountability. The whole mess didn't stay contained within the family either. Word had started spreading around our community, and soon enough neighbors were taking sides. Some supported me, saying that I had every right to get justice for what had been done. Others, usually older folks who knew my dad for years, thought I was going too far, saying family issues shouldn't be taken to court. It felt like everyone had an opinion, and there was no way to avoid the gossip and judgment coming from all directions. Things took a turn when my extended family got involved online. My cousins and aunts started posting vague messages about family loyalty and how family matters should stay private. A couple of them shared parts of the story on social media, twisting the narrative to make it seem like I was the one tearing our family apart over a car. Suddenly, it wasn't just a legal battle, it was turning into a public spectacle. Meanwhile, the legal fees were piling up. Every step of the way, my lawyer fees kept increasing, and I realized that if this continued, I might have to find another way to cover the costs. People on Reddit were aware of what was happening, and many suggested starting a fundraiser to help me with legal fees. I was hesitant at first, but with the family drama escalating, the idea didn't seem as outlandish as it once did. Then came the final low blow from my dad. In a last-ditch effort to make things difficult for me, he contacted my employer, hoping to get me in trouble or paint me in a bad light. He even told them I was dragging our family through the mud and creating problems at home. My boss called me in for a private conversation, and for a second I thought maybe my dad's antics had actually affected my job. But to my surprise, my employer was completely supportive. They assured me they understood the situation and didn't hold anything against me. In fact, they found my dad's actions unprofessional and uncalled for. After that, it became clear that our family was fracturing beyond repair. Some relatives stopped talking to me entirely, siding with my dad. Others, who hadn't wanted to get involved before, finally reached out to quietly show their support. Lines were being drawn everywhere, and it was clear that no one was neutral anymore. My dad's actions had split the family right down the middle, with one side fully supporting him and the other seeing just how far he'd gone. At this point, I knew I couldn't let this go. The damage to the car, the betrayal, the way he'd tried to manipulate everyone against me, it was too much. This wasn't just about getting my car back anymore, it was about holding him accountable. I decided to pursue damages for the repairs, and my lawyer agreed that we had a solid case. Every step of this battle had only strengthened my resolve. As things moved closer to a court date, my lawyer advised me to gather every document, every text, and any proof of the damage. He wanted us fully prepared, knowing that my dad wasn't likely to back down. It was surreal, preparing for a legal showdown against my own father, but it felt like the only option left. This was no longer about just a car, it was about principle. Update 4. With the court date confirmed, things started feeling more intense, like the final showdown was approaching. My lawyer reached out with the date and a plan to gather all remaining evidence and make sure every document, every record of ownership, and proof of damages was in order. This was no longer just a family dispute, it was a full-on legal case, and both sides were gearing up. A few days before the court date, I got a surprise call from a few family members, including my mom. They wanted me to reconsider and drop the case, saying the situation had spiraled too far. They pleaded that if this went to court, my dad would lose everything, that it would ruin him. They hinted that he might even lose the family home if things didn't go his way. I listened, but nothing they said made me change my mind. He had been given so many chances, and each time he'd chosen to dig his heels in deeper. Then my dad decided to issue his own ultimatum. He showed up at my place unannounced, making it clear he'd had enough. He told me to either drop the charges or he would cut me out of the family entirely. He claimed he would write me out of the will, make sure I didn't see a dime from him in the future, and that he'd cut off any remaining ties. It wasn't just an idle threat, he seemed dead serious, like he'd rather throw away any relationship we had left than admit he'd done something wrong. It was around this time that family secrets started spilling out. During a heated argument, one of my uncles mentioned that this wasn't the first time my dad had pulled something like this. He'd borrowed or sold things that didn't belong to him more than once in the past, taking whatever he wanted to pay off various debts. My mom later pulled me aside and admitted that my dad's financial problems went much deeper than any of us knew. She told me he'd been hiding a significant gambling debt for years. Every time things seemed calm, he was just covering up the chaos beneath the surface. She looked torn, but it was clear she'd been aware of his problem for a long time and had tried to keep it from the rest of the family. I decided to update my Reddit post with everything that had come out. The support I got was overwhelming. People shared similar stories of family betrayals and offered advice, legal resources, and emotional support. It was like an army of strangers was rallying behind me, telling me I wasn't alone in this and that I had every right to pursue justice. Then, a few members of my extended family reached out with even more stories. Apparently, my dad had manipulated them for money in the past as well. He'd made promises, borrowed items, and even swindled some of them out of money under false pretenses, all to cover his debts. This pattern was worse than I'd realized, and it was clear I was far from the only one he'd wronged. Meanwhile, my lawyer dug deeper and discovered that by selling my car without permission, my dad might have committed other legal violations. This added another layer to the case, one that could increase the damages he'd be liable for. When he heard about this, my dad went on a rampage, accusing me of trying to ruin him. He told people I was pursuing this case out of spite, and he even suggested that I'd somehow manipulated the buyer into returning the car just to make him look bad. Life at home became unbearable. Every time I was there were arguments, silent treatments, and tension so thick it was hard to breathe. At one point, I started considering moving out temporarily just to get some peace. A close friend offered me a place to stay if things got too bad, saying he'd noticed how this situation was affecting me and just wanted to help. Even my coworkers, who'd heard bits and pieces of the story, began rallying around me. They chipped in to help with court expenses, offered advice on handling the family pressure, and some even shared stories about family issues they'd faced, making me feel less isolated. Meanwhile, some Reddit users with legal backgrounds reached out, suggesting ways to push for a mediated settlement. They said it might prevent the case from becoming a public spectacle, and a few even volunteered to connect me with legal resources to strengthen my case. The Reddit community kept me focused, reminding me that I wasn't alone in this, no matter how isolated things felt at home. My dad's behavior took a turn for the worse. He started showing up at my workplace, trying to talk things out but always ended up making a scene. It happened more than once, and eventually security had to step in. I didn't want to drag my work into this, but his actions left me no choice. The last time he showed up, my boss had to step in and ask him to leave, which was embarrassing but also somehow empowering. It was like a line had been crossed, and I realized just how far he was willing to go to avoid facing the truth. That's when I knew for certain that I couldn't back down. I'd spent weeks hoping he'd come to his senses, but with the court date approaching, it was clear that wasn't going to happen. Every time he pushed, it only strengthened my resolve. Dropping this case would only enable him to keep doing what he'd always done, using and manipulating those closest to him. It wasn't just about the car anymore, it was about putting an end to a cycle. As I prepared for the court date, gathering every last piece of evidence, I felt a kind of clarity I hadn't felt before. This wasn't just my fight, it was standing up for everyone he'd hurt, everyone he'd taken advantage of. There was no going back now. Update 5. The day of the court appearance finally arrived. Walking into that courtroom felt surreal, especially knowing my dad would be sitting on the other side, facing the consequences of his actions. The tension in the room was thick, and as I took my seat, I glanced over to see him, but he wouldn't look at me. It was like we were strangers, separated by a legal dispute instead of a lifetime of shared family memories. My dad's lawyer opened with a defense built around familial necessity. They argued that my dad's actions were justified because he was doing what he believed was best for the family, especially in a financial crisis. They claimed that he had the right to take the car as part of a sacrifice to keep the family stable. It was a reach, to say the least, but they were clearly leaning on the idea that a parent should be able to make decisions for the family without facing legal repercussions. When my lawyer got up, he didn't waste any time dismantling their argument. He laid out everything: the ownership documents, proof that I had purchased and customized the car entirely on my own, and records of my dad's pattern of borrowing and selling things under questionable circumstances. It painted a clear picture of what had happened and showed that my dad's actions were far from a one-time mistake. He then highlighted the damage to the car, emphasizing that it went beyond just an impulsive sale. This was theft, plain and simple, and then came the unexpected turn. Out of nowhere, one of my cousins, someone who hadn't been vocal about the whole situation until that day, stood up to testify. He shared a story of how my dad had borrowed money from him a few years back under the guise of family support and never paid it back. He went on to reveal that this pattern had affected others in the family too. As he spoke, it became clear that there was a trail of broken promises and financial manipulation that my dad had left behind over the years. The judge listened intently, and I could see the shift in the room. The weight of the testimony was undeniable. Watching my dad listen to all of this, I could see the strain in his face, the way he tightened his jaw and clenched his fists. When the testimony ended, he couldn't hold back any longer. He erupted, accusing me of turning the family against him, shouting that I'd manipulated everyone to make him look like the villain. His outburst did nothing to help his case. It only seemed to harden the judge's stance. The judge called for order, giving my dad a warning as he struggled to regain his composure. Once everything settled down, the judge took a moment to gather their thoughts, clearly impacted by what had just unfolded. When they finally spoke, it was clear where things were headed. They ruled in my favor, ordering my dad to pay damages for the unauthorized sale and the repair costs, along with additional punitive damages for the emotional and financial toll his actions had caused. My dad's face fell. He looked genuinely shocked, like he hadn't fully grasped the weight of his actions until that moment. For the first time, he seemed to realize that there were real, irreversible consequences. The ruling didn't just settle the legal aspect, it deepened the divide within our family. Some relatives expressed support, saying it was about time he was held accountable. Others, though, still felt I had gone too far. They argued that I should have let it go. That family should always come first, no matter what. The rift was undeniable, and I knew that for better or worse, things would never be the same. After the case, my dad reached out with what felt like an attempted apology. He said he was sorry things had gone this far, that he hadn't intended for it to become such a mess. But there was something missing, like he didn't fully grasp why I'd felt so betrayed. It was hard to tell if he genuinely regretted what he'd done or if he just regretted the consequences he was now facing. Over the next few days, I began to feel a sense of closure. I'd stood up for myself, set boundaries, and made it clear that I wasn't going to tolerate being taken advantage of, even by family. Reflecting on everything, I realized that family loyalty didn't mean sacrificing my own self-respect. Setting boundaries was necessary, even if it meant losing relationships that weren't based on mutual respect and trust. My Reddit post blew up again after I shared the final update. People flooded the comments with support, praising me for standing my ground. Many shared stories of similar family struggles, of having to make tough choices when family crossed boundaries. The support from strangers reminded me that I wasn't alone, that there were others who understood the pain of betrayal from those closest to you. With a newfound sense of independence, I decided to make a big change. I started looking for my own place, somewhere to finally live on my own terms, away from the family drama. Moving out was a huge step, but it felt like the right one. It was time to build a life that wasn't overshadowed by old family issues or toxic dynamics. This experience taught me a lot. It showed me the importance of boundaries, of standing up for myself, and of finding strength in unexpected places, like an online community of strangers. I was moving forward, ready to start a chapter defined by my own choices, free from the burdens of past conflicts. I felt optimistic about the future, finally ready to focus on building a life on my own terms.